longevity lifestyle designers. This is Zach here with secretsoflongevity.com. So the nature of this video is a little bit different. I'm putting it up right now. I didn't put it up yesterday or the day before, which I would have liked to have done. However, I wanted to be a little bit wary of people's beliefs and didn't want to piss on anyone's parade, basically. So by putting it up now, I'm hoping, this event just happened, Christmas Eve, going on to Christmas, and I really wanted to bring these facts to light and my views on this whole time of year. And even though it's after the fact, perhaps next year people might reconsider, depending on where they are with this whole issue, and they might start to celebrate things in a different way. So you might see right in the corner here, this is the top of our Christmas tree. It's actually a pine tree that has a pot, so we didn't actually cut anything down, and it will grow. At some point it's going to be too big for the house, and we'll have to take it outside to plant it after maybe a couple of years. Here, I'll point the camera down just so you can see it. So yeah, it's just a little sort of cute little tree. It was very nice to have that. I mean, I have grown up with Christmas as my family's tradition, and while I've never grown up going to a Christian church, my relatives haven't done that, although I believe my grandparents did when they were young, but they never embraced it fully. None of my relatives are outspoken atheists. I would also say they're not hardcore religious believers either, or even part-time religious believers. On my father's side, my grandfather, who's no longer living, was a Christian minister, so his parents were quite religious, and my father, although growing up in that environment, is very not religious at all. I'm not going to talk about his beliefs specifically because that's not the point of this video. But yeah, I have Christianity in my past. That's my ancestral heritage. However, that doesn't mean I just blatantly embrace it just because that's what my relatives did. So growing up in a very belief-neutral household, although I would definitely say I've always had a very spiritual life, I'm not religious in the slightest. And I've always had a lot of consternation towards religion because I just never quite understood a lot of these beliefs that these people hold. They seem quite not based in anything realistic. There are stories that didn't really make sense to me in the ways that they were put together. Whenever in the past I would try to read the Bible, it just was really fragmented. You can tell it's been edited countless hundreds of times, especially a lot of things lost in translation. Yet so much emphasis is put on these stories, and they get turned into other stories, and down the line they have turned into some of the celebrations that our society at large still follows. So that major one of the year, of course, is Christmas. So I'm going to start with a brief description of where we're at now and give a very non-detailed history of how we got to the point we're at now, and then perhaps sort of look at the poor foundation of these facts. So Christmas is supposedly the celebration of Jesus' birth, and for some reason, which no one's, at least most mainstream people don't understand, is why there's this association with this character named Father Christmas, Santa Claus. And when we start to look into the past of where this story sort of starts, we start to see that it's one story leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, sort of like a game of broken telephone. And this really is the problem with historical folklore, specifically religious folklore, and that's why actual academic history, which is not quite as recent in terms of how far it goes back, where there's actually historians keeping track of things, is much more accurate because there's a very firm desire not to tamper with the facts, not to embellish things. However, talking about Santa Claus, which was definitely folkloric, the first thing we have to look at is that Santa, as we know him today with the red suit, the fur trim, the reindeer and all that, or if we just focus on his attire, which is mostly red with the white trim, this is a product of a marketing campaign from Coca-Cola, who first took one of the Kris Kringle, or the myths from somewhere in Europe, probably St. Nicholas, and turned him change the color of his robes. Just to illustrate how easily these myths get created is if you consider an engagement ring. Some people just assume that an engagement ring, a diamond engagement ring, is been centuries, if not thousands of years old, a tradition. However, it was only created in the generation of perhaps my grandparents or even their parents. So it would be my great-grandparents. It was actually De Beers that created the whole phenomenon of a diamond ring is an engagement ring. So before that, if people were using rings for weddings, it wasn't strictly diamonds, it could have been anything. There was no set tradition about that, but a tradition was created out of something, and in this case it was a marketing campaign. And same with Santa Claus. It was a marketing campaign to have that red and white suit, to really help put that out there as something that's good and enjoyable. So there's that association with the colors of the Coca-Cola bottle or Coca-Cola can and this enjoyable figure from history. So on to the next part. If you look at St. Nicholas, who Father Christmas or Santa Claus came from, he was completely fabricated by Clement Clarke Moore, a poet and storyteller from a while back, who wrote the things like A Night Before Christmas and some other poems from that era. So there's some ideas as to where he came up with this idea of St. Nicholas, but it's very obvious that this was completely made up. There's no idea of St. Nicholas before that. But there were ideas of Santa Claus-like figures before that, which probably influenced him. And one of these would probably have been the Christkindl, or often called the Christ Child in one word, or the Martin-kilgour, which was a German figure, also known as Nicholas in Furs, Nicholas in Skins. Or sorry, I think the Christkindl came even before Nicholas in Furs and Nicholas in Skins. But before even this St. Nicholas idea was this idea of a gift giver who was dressed in sort of animal skins and furs. Sort of very rugged image, and again he'd go around giving gifts. Going even further back, that idea originally came from this Christkindl or Christenkind idea, which was the Christ child, and this was literally sort of like the spirit of Jesus Christ, but as a child that would go around giving gifts to children. But he had a helper, or helpers, which were dwarves or midgets, or one dwarf, one midget, depends on where you look. There's going to be multiple sayings of what that was. But basically, the idea of Santa and his elves comes from Jesus as a child giving gifts with a midget dwarf as a slave or a pet or a helper or some sort of enforced labor of some sort. So it's a very strange concept that we now have this celebration around. And that's the connection between Jesus' birth and this bizarre thing we have today. And by the way, the dwarf's name was Pelsnickel, and that in some way grew into this larger figure that was later Santa in Furs, or Nicholas in Furs, and on into Santa. So it's Jesus' pet dwarf that became Santa. So it's very bizarre if we really look at the mythology and folklore surrounding it. And in my honest opinion, it should be out in the open, people talking about this and saying, you know, we're beyond just sticking to tradition just for tradition's sake. You know, keep the celebration, keep the gift-giving and merriment, but let's abandon these old ideas that don't have any factual value whatsoever. It's really doing a disservice to humanity, to our intelligence as humans, and as parents. A lot of these ideas were brought into the world, obviously to bring enjoyment to children, but they're also a way of manipulating children with the ideas of Santa not giving you presents if you're bad. And looking even further back, some of these older figures had sort of like these demon helpers that would take children away in sacks if they were bad. So it's not only they didn't get gifts if they were bad, they were punished, like taken away or scared by these creatures that worked for Santa, like these old forms of Santa or the Christ child. So yeah, it definitely is things used to manipulate the children, and as I've talked about in videos before, religion is really sort of a way of the higher up or the parents of society, which is people who just decide they're going to be authority figures over society, and they use scare tactics and fear to motivate people to do good things. I talked about this in my video on karma in the past, and I'll post a link to that at the end of this video if you'd like to hear my views on that. So that idea of karma and sin are just, belief systems we take on to enforce ourselves to do good things when we could just decide to do those good things out of the goodness of our heart without this fear being a motivator. It's sort of a juvenile, immature way of being, and we can move beyond that, in my humble opinion. So like I mentioned, culturally I've grown up with Christian traditions around me, even though I've never been a part of them in an institution. I always sort of, to some degree, thought that there was some factual evidence that supported this, and that's why people were doing it. It only seems logical. I'm all for using Christmas decorations and even singing some of the hymns, or rather Christmas carols, and hearing them on the radio that promote the festive atmosphere. However, where I start to get insulted by the intelligence of our society is when we start to hear the religious overtones in these things. I think they need to be dropped completely, and what I'm going to do next is start to look at the evidence that supports whether Jesus Christ of Nazareth actually ever existed. So that's the title of this video, is the Christ myth, or Christ myth, should be the official name that this holiday should be changed to, or we can just simply revert to the original holiday or celebration that has been celebrated for many, many thousands of years, which is the winter solstice, which among my more alternative group of friends in this area, I do celebrate that. But obviously with family, that tradition of Christmas prevails, and I do engage in that. So my first point is just going to be basically that there's no historical evidence outside of the New Testament that Jesus Christ ever existed. All of the main historians of the time of that first century, whether it was while Jesus was alive or even slightly afterwards, none of them make any mention to him. And right here I have the transcript to The Quest for an Open-Ended Longevity by Peter Ragnar, which is also titled How Thinking Made Stupid Smart. And this is just his very lengthy volume, which has a portion in it devoted to this idea, and it's well cited. So the part I'm going to read from is actually from another book, which was called The Sons of God, and that's spelled S-U-N-S, by Acharius, which was a pen name for the author. I forget the original name, but it's A-C-H-A-R-Y-A-S. And that's a very good book. I haven't read it myself, but I've seen it quoted in a number of texts that I've looked through. So I'm going to read off a number of historians who never made any reference to Jesus, and these were all the main ones of the time. There was Olaus Perseus of 60 CE, Columella, from the 1st century, Dio Chrysostom, who lived between 40 and 112 CE, Justus of Tiberias, 80 CE, Livy, 59 BCE to 17 CE, so that was during the time of Christ exactly, Lucanus, 63 CE, Lucius Florus, 1st and 2nd century, Petronius, 66 CE, Phaedrus, 15 BCE to 50 CE, Philo Judaeus, 20 BCE to 50 CE, Phlegon, 1st century, Pliny the Elder, perhaps 23 CE to 69 CE, Plutarch from 46 to 119 CE, Pomponius Mela, 40 CE, Rufus Catius, 1st century, Quintilian, 35 to 100 CE, Quintus Curtius, 1st century, Seneca, 48 to 65 CE, Silius Italicus, 25 to 101 CE, Statius Caelesius, 1st century, Theon of Smyrna, 70 to 135 CE, Valerius Flaccus, 1st century, Valerius Maximus, 20th century, and then there's a few more without dates that were from around that time that also didn't make any mention of any existence of anyone by the name of Jesus of Nazareth that did these things that are commonly ascribed to this story. So that's Appianus, Arian, Favorinus, Olaus, Gellius, Hermogenes, Justinus, Pausanias, and Ptolemy. And that's 31 historians who didn't make any mention of Jesus in any of their works at any time. The number of first century historians that make any mention of Jesus whatsoever equals 0, a big 0. There is one often mentioned historian who was a Jewish historian named Josephus, who's said to have talked about and referred to Jesus in some of his writings. However, this was after 60 years after Jesus lived, so in the 2nd century. Plus also many academic scholars recognize that this is not a reliable source, because number one, his style of writing heavily indicates that this was either heavily altered by Christian hands because of the style of the writing. It wasn't in the Jewish historian style from that time period, and there's basically no academic scholars that recognize that as absolute proof that this means that Jesus existed. Some of you have seen the very popular online documentary Zeitgeist, which has one section that devoted to talking about the Christ myth, and there's a lot of great points in that, and some of the work I've looked at shares a lot of the same sources as that, but then also has other sources outside of that. Some of the main points from that are the fact that they're looking at the commonalities between the different gods from different religions that all share almost the identical story to how this mythical solar god figure rose to become a figure of compassion and salvation, and then was later killed by somebody by the religious sort of temple in that area, and it was often in the form of a crucifixion. And also that this figure was born of a virgin birth, but in no particular order. One of the first ones was Osiris, who was born unto a virgin, came into the world, had a lot of the same names ascribed to him, such as Savior, and he was eventually killed and resurrected. And then there's many others that actually have even more similarities, because they also share the crucifixion, killing, and then thus resurrection after the fact. People like Hercules, Krishna of India, Horus of Egypt, which was Osiris' son, so it was repeated, the same storyline or sort of foundational proceedings was in his son. Mithra of Persia, Tammuz of Babylon, Attis of Phrygia, Heracles of Greece, Chiang-Ti in China, Bacchus of Egypt, Bacchus of Greece, Christ of Chaldea, Adonis of Greece, and so I could go on, but there's dozens upon dozens of ancient deities which were ascribed this solar deity iconography that portrayed them in this sort of born unto a virgin, lived this life, disappeared for a certain period of time, came back, was this, big head honcho savior type figure, and was later killed by either crucifixion or hanging on a tree. Involves some sort of like hanging them up, and then later resurrected. So all these relationships between all these figures, and Jesus being sort of one of the latter ones, really paints a clear picture that there was something going on with the clergy or religious folk of the time periods of these different figures, where they were copying from other periods and other religions as inspiration for their own. Either that, and or they were ascribing these characteristics to the sun. The fact that these were solar, or deifying the sun as a figure and creating a story out of it. And in fact, the entire Bible and many of the stories can be related to a lot of astronomical events. And this is known as astrotheology, and is certainly the basis of all religions down throughout history. And the further back we go, the more realistic more heavily they relate to the sky and astrotheology. And if we go back far enough, they actually do, we do see the evidence that these were just basically people worshipping the stars, the sun, the moon, the sky, the earth, etc. So again, that idea of the sun being that central figure, which is the basis for celebrating Christmas, we see that the sun goes through 4 seasons, or 4 quarters, in the zodiac, which is 12 houses or signs. And if we just look at the 4 quarters, like I was saying, which is the winter solstice, summer solstice, and the 2 equinoxes, fall and spring, we see that the sun and the number of hours it remains in the sky at these different times can be related to this story. So when the sun's at its lowest at winter solstice, it actually reaches that lowest point on the 21st, and it actually stays that way for 3 days, and it doesn't actually move. So every day, using military type instruments, there can be a noticeable change in the degrees of precisely what time the sun is at every interval. So if on the 21st it's at the lowest interval of how high it actually gets at its zenith in the sky at 12 noon, for example, for the next 3 days it's actually not going to rise any further, because in a way it's almost like the 22nd or 23rd is the lowest point, and then the 24th is just equally as low. So if on the winter solstice, the official winter solstice, it gets to the lowest point and there's 3 days, that middle day would be technically the lowest, except there's actually no change in the degree it is, because it's almost as if, it's reaching that peak and it's going to start getting brighter and brighter. Or it could be seen the other way. It's starting to get brighter and brighter and longer days after that. So if it's reaching that low point, there's that sort of dip where there's virtually no change in how long the day is for 3 days. And then the 25th, Christmas Day, is when that sun starts to come up again in terms of having longer days, which we're in now, thankfully. That's the thing to celebrate, is the returning of the light to the world. And that's what was celebrated, because it was a big enjoyment to the return of the sun, because that ensures life, growth, bountiful harvests, plenty of vitamin D on the skin, makes you feel good. And the darkness was generally seen as a bad thing. And the crucifixion around the time of the spring equinox is a time when the sun is officially seen to have returned completely, because that's when the days become longer than the nights in most of the world, and that's when it's seen as the sun returning full force, or in other words, resurrecting, because it's coming back and being more powerful than the dark. We're getting more light than darkness in a 24-hour period. So by all means, I'm not simply a person of strict left brain thinking that focuses only on facts and science and really sort of hard-nosed evidence, and there's no room for anything of an intuitive sort of paranormal nature. However, I am very skeptical of things when I see myths being portrayed, exaggerations, fables, and these things carried down that do change over time just because they're not rooted in anything of substance. I think it's definitely a time in humanity's history where we need to start letting these things go and moving on to bigger and better things. It's not enough just to say that I'm a person of faith and I believe in this, no matter how much evidence to the contrary is suggesting the latter. And I'm just going to hold tightly to this idea just because, it served me in some way. People who say they're a person of faith are given too much leeway, like, oh, you're honorable, you have enough strength to just be faithful in something. It's actually the reverse. You're delusional enough, you don't have enough thinking capacity to actually reason with the idea that, there's no evidence for these things I'm believing in. I personally haven't had any personal practical experience in it either. I'm just believing some book that's heavily translated, heavily altered, heavily tampered with over the many hundreds, if not thousands of years that it's been in existence. So I'm not just talking about Christianity here, I'm talking about all religions, of course. And coming back around full circle, what does this have to do with longevity? The title and subject of this channel and all my work online is that we really have to be willing and able to take things seriously and look at things critically to determine what's best for us in our life. And good reasonable thinking turns into good reasonable results. So that sort of right-hand brain, which is more intuitive, creative, feminine, doesn't need to be relegated to the trash heap by any means. Faith is something that is not of either hemisphere. It's more of a crutch, something that you lean in on when you're in a place of disaster or peril, and you need to just assume that something's protecting you. And this is not a virtue. A virtue that could take its place, for instance, could be something like assuming that you're protected and healthy and kept well by the community around you, by the forces of the universe, however you may see them to be, and just knowing that that will take place. And if you're ever in an instance where that's not happening, there's going to be a lesson behind it. That's a very spiritual way to approach the world, and that's healthy in my opinion. But assuming that, you know, certain groups that say these things need to be relied upon, which is what we know as faith, is definitely something that hinders longevity, in the sense that, you know, this is altering the way we feel about a variety of things. If we're not reasonable about that, how can we be reasonable about our health and be discerning in what we choose to do in our entire lifestyle? So there's a great many centenarians that we see, at least I've seen in my research of old people who've lived to advanced ages, that do say things like, when they're interviewed, like, what made you live so long? They'll say something like, oh, I believed in the power of Christ, or it's the power of God. And if we were to think critically about this, we know that, you know, it's not their faith in that one thing, because if we met a person of advanced age that said something similar, who was living in the time of the Greeks, they would have said, it's my power and belief in Zeus, he was my savior, if that was even a savior figure. But it's actually knowing and having the emotional feelings of that you're safe and protected, and that you're not worried about, you know, the world ending, people attacking you or stealing something from you, that you're living in a safe environment. So that feeling of safety and contentment comes from, in many cases, religion, but it can come from spirituality, or just, if you choose to not have any type of spiritual leaning, it can just be from being content being where you are. There's no need to have those benefits of religion and belief that is often cited as being a cause for longevity and seen in centenarians. It's what that causes in the body, not the belief in those things. If, for example, you took a segment of the population where, in North America, where 90% of the people that were surveyed were all Christians, and out of that, you know, multiple thousands of people, there was a couple dozen centenarians, or at least out of these people, a couple dozen of them lived to be centenarians, and they kept track of them over their lifetime. And they interviewed them all, and, you know, by chance, all 12 of them, if there happened to be 12 in that multiple thousand group that lived to be 100 and something, if they all happened to be from that 90% of Christians, and it was shown that they were all Christians and they believed in the power of Christ to be their Savior, then there might be someone doing this research that might come to the conclusion that, oh, this is a reason, this is clearly a cause for longevity, believing in this mythical figure. However, just thinking about this, and from my explanation of it, you can easily tell that the fact that 90% of the people surveyed already believed in that, that's the reason why so many of these centenarians had that quality in them. So a lot of these famous, long-lived people were religious because, you know, 100 years ago when these people were being born, there was such a wide acceptance of religion that everyone practiced it. There were no, you know, Taoists in North America. There were no yogis. There were no atheists. So all these people that are now coming in and hearing these things about you need to believe in God to live a long time, they don't need to convert themselves to some idea just for the sake of being healthier. And having said that, I think it is definitely healthier to abandon such limiting beliefs, and I hope in the future we can start to see the diminishment of this holiday, at least its ascribed reason for having it, and we can switch it to something more traditional, such as the winter solstice, that our true, really great ancestors would have originally celebrated. And with that, I'm going to say take care and embrace life for that one.